Hi everyone, my name is Nicollette Gooding. I am a Master's of Social Work student at the University of Toronto, currently completing my practicum with For a Safer Space. Today I will be sharing information about historical trauma and how it can affect ourselves and also those around us. So what is historical trauma? On a larger scale to intergenerational trauma, where the trauma is within the family, intergenerational trauma is related to a genocide of people where some major event is aimed at a particularly group because of their status as an oppressed group as a whole. Experts say it could be a war, it could be cultural, such as when a community language is banned and when they are not allowed to speak, print, or practice it. It could also be a desecration of monuments such as graveyards and other sacred sites. Any of those events that have to do with ignoring the humanity of a group's practices and having that part of social policy, be it formal or informal, where it's not a crime to do that. The events and experiences most commonly associated with historical trauma include slavery, the experiences of the Indigenous communities after European colonialization, and the Holocaust. However, experts say historical trauma is not related to these three alone. It is important, especially as practitioners, to look at acts around the world, such as in Rwanda, the Balkan Wars, and wherever we see a particular group that is being oppressed. Another example experts have brought with them is also the traumas Europeans have experienced and may have brought with them to the Americas during their times of violence and abuse to other groups and communities. Just like intergenerational trauma, the effects of historical trauma are far reaching. While they may begin with slavery to the colonies, they can persist today in forms of colonial ideologies. Experts who work within the African and Black communities constantly see the effects of historical trauma from experiences of oppression and slavery. Historical trauma has morphed into a very high amount of contemporary trauma over time, which is constantly being built on top of one another and can be seen as a form of cumulative trauma. It must be understood that communities just don't go through one trauma and it goes away. Experts also know that the violence experiences in many of these communities, for example, the way children are taught to behave, the over incarceration of these communities, and the over punishment of killings of the boys and persons due to, again, the policies that are rooted in anti Black racism. Experts also say that very overlying health issues exist in these communities, such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and often very high undiagnosed of mental health concerns. Similarly, the Indigenous communities have faced both told and untold trauma. Most of the historical traumas for Indigenous communities were around colonialization, a banning of Indigenous languages, a banning of traditional religious practices, a banning of tribal governments, a banning of tribes, removal of formal and informal practices, warfare, and disease. All of these occurrences impact a person's abilities to continue their cultural practices. The results of these events and experiences have led to the loss of language and culture in Indigenous communities, but that's not all. Unfortunately, due to these traumas, statistics show that the effects of colonialization and its violence has perpetuated the rate of violence in these communities around them. Experts have long said chronic health issues exist in these communities, such as diabetes and mental health concerns, which may be coped with in unhealthy ways due to these colonial impacts. Overall, it is important to note that those with individual histories of trauma may be more likely to experience negative behavioral health outcomes, as well as decreases in daily functioning and quality of life. Compounding individual trauma with historical trauma is defined as cumulative psychological and emotional wounding across generations from massive group trauma. Historical trauma occurs at all levels, individual, family, and at the community level. Although each level is distinct, they are all interrelated and connected. Individual responses to historical trauma are influenced by the experiences and responses of family members, individual and familiar experiences to make up also for the collective community response. Thus, actions at the individual and family levels reinforce the way the community responds. The multidirectional impacts of historical trauma at the familial level include reduced family functioning and increased parenting stress. Likewise, community level response can include the loss of traditional culture, including loss of cultural values, the traditional rites of passage, high rates of chronic disease, and high rates of alcoholism. Although empirical evidence is not yet available, it is thought that community level response to historical trauma include the weakening of social structures, alcoholism, and suicide. Historical trauma has a pervasive impact on individuals, families, communities, underscoring the need for trauma-informed work with populations at risk. Signs and symptoms that somebody may have experienced this. Historical trauma is cumulative and can really affect all generations. Descendants who have not directly experienced a traumatic event can exhibit the signs and symptoms of trauma, such as depression, fixation on trauma, low self-esteem, anger, and self-destructive behavior. Historical trauma in terms of social work practice has emerged as a critical area of study in understanding and addressing long-term health problems and communities. It can be thought of as a macro-level factor that has direct implications for micro and meso-level processes. Although most trauma intervention models are deficit-based, current efforts explore how communities maintain wellness after experiencing forms of trauma. These efforts focus specifically on how communities have been resilient despite the experiences of these mass traumas. Specific to Indigenous communities, there is a renewed focus on the positive aspects of recapturing lost culture in addressing their historical trauma. A goal of these efforts is to promote psychological well-being and the ability to process and share accounts of their trauma. Through this process, individuals become more attuned to their past, present, and can think about their futures, thereby developing a sense of self and cultural continuity as a result as well. Similarly, a prominent protective factor is the engagement of those in the community is rebuilding and helping others heal in a community sense. Similar to with intergenerational trauma, historical trauma can be resolved if a holistic, tailored approach is used. Providers should recognize that cultural, racial, and ethnic groups are heterogeneous, and not every member of a group has the same response to a current or past traumatic event. This could be done through individual or group therapy, which can be supportive for folks to know that they aren't alone or helpless, and knowing that there have maybe been existing factors outside of their control. When communities process things and understand them, they can often find healthy coping mechanisms. And when communities find these healthy coping mechanisms, they can heal, redefine themselves, and reclaim a part of their life. If the trauma or abuse is ongoing, it's crucial to stop this cycle, which may require a huge amount of encouragement and support, such as community building. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. I hope it was helpful, and take care.